morning, everyone. Good morning. Thanks for having me. How many people attended ASEE in Columbus? Now, how many people have been just in the past, but maybe didn't make it that year? All right. So I'm delighted to be here. I'm actually very passionate about this research subject. I started as a graduate student. I was working with Dr. Terrell Strayhorn. He was my co-advisor. He had an NSF project where he was looking at Black and Hispanic students, particularly males in engineering and their trajectory, barriers they face, and we looked for ways that they could overcome it. So I started collecting some of this data then, but then actually came up with ideas for a research paper and path forward more recently. All right. And so the title, if you haven't seen it, is From Categories to Success Strategies. And we have a term that we call buoyant believers. I'll explain that in a bit more details. Because I'm a pretty artistic person, I created infographics, well, with the help of an undergraduate research assistant, but it was my idea to create these infographics just because I feel like you go to research talks, they have papers or journal articles, you don't necessarily want to read 10, 20, 30 pages just to get a general idea of what people are doing. So if you haven't seen it, there should be one in front. This is for like the current project, which is lessons learned from buoyant believers, but the backside shows you all four categories. This talk is gonna primarily focus on those who are buoyant believers, but you can get a sense of both. They are two different conference papers, which we're hoping to turn into a journal article within the next year or two, but you have those as a resource. Any questions before I get started? All right, well, if you're a social media person, you can see my following there. So if you wanna add me or follow me on Twitter, and then ASEE Mind, I would tell you if you're looking for other papers along similar topics, that's probably the go-to place. So there are specific journal articles as well, but because it takes a while for journal articles to actually come out into publication, ASEE Mind is probably a second good resource. All right. And so I will try to make this interactive. I don't like to lecture because I understand there are limitations to lecturing. I don't like to stand just in one place, so you'll see me moving around. Hopefully that isn't distracting. It's just my energy level and excitement for the topic. But could you start off, just take a moment, maybe close your eyes, envision yourself in your current role. So whether that's a graduate student, faculty member, staff, do you see yourself as being confident and resilient? So we'll start with confident. So if you can raise your hand if you see yourself as being confident in your current position, again, eyes closed just so you're not judging your peers. All right, hands down. All right, how about resilient? All right, hands back down. And then if you raise your hand for both, could you raise your hand again? So you're confident and resilient in your current position? All right, thank you. Okay, so keep that in mind as we're having this discussion, and maybe your own positionality, your own level of success. All right, the way I'll go through it, I always like to give an introduction of kind of the flow for the presentation. It's pretty standard. I'll give an introduction, explain the purpose of the study, what research informed it, what was our framework, what methods did we use, what did we find, and then what can we do with those findings in terms of recommendations. All right. And so to start, I wasn't able to do this in a limited conference presentation, but I definitely want to take the time now to give you a bit of a background story. And so I said that my co-advisor was Dr. Strayhorn. He wrote a book chapter here, in this book, The Evolving Challenges of Black College Students. The book chapter was actually titled Buoyant Believers, Resilient Self-Efficacy and Academic Success of Low-Income African-American Collegians. And so in this chapter is where he came up with the term buoyant believers. But there was a story even beyond it. And so he explains in the opening section of that paragraph that he was inspired by a play called A Raisin in the Sun. Anyone heard of it? All right. And so it is a historical play, probably one of the most prominent and popular plays in the African-American community when they're talking about facing adversity. And so you have a Black family who has lost the patriarch, the grandfather of the family, but then fortunately, although money never can supplement the loss of a loved one, they got an insurance check. And so the grandmother is looking for ways to use the insurance check to prosper the family for generations to come. And one way she's looking to do that is to integrate the family into a predominantly white community so they can become homeowners for the first time. And so in that story, without giving away the entire play, if you haven't seen it, there are a few quotes that she offers because her son, since he is the oldest male member of the family, there are certain customs based on gender roles or dynamics. And so she's trying to encourage him to be the man of the household, right? Or the man of the family. And so although she has much more wisdom and experience, she lets him kind of make some mistakes and then offers loving, constructive criticism along the way. And one quote she gave him at times when he was starting to be, hard on himself and his family members is that he should always find ways to love other people, and that really when viewing someone and what they've accomplished, you shouldn't judge them or kind of assess the situation without first understanding what they've gone through, right? And so that's what she's saying in terms of hills and valleys. So what has that person overcome? What have they gone through in order to get where they are today? And so that situates our understanding of buoyant believers, and we felt like it entailed levels of confidence and resilience. And so that's where that term was coined. Questions? All right. And so another kind of backstory to this approach, how many people have heard of anti-deficit thinking? And so a lot of work that you'll see situated with students, especially in terms of retention or academic success, they focus on students and we try to fix the students, right? What's wrong with the students? They don't come from the best schools. They aren't motivated, right? And so it tends to be a deficit way of thinking, and that tends to be even more popular amongst underrepresented groups. And a lot of that is due to biases we get from the media, our own limited lived experiences. And so we come in assuming that because someone's black, they're also low income, which historically is more likely to be the case, but that's not true for all students. Or because they're a minority student, they care more about sports than academics, right? And so many negative, deficit-based ways of thinking limit our ability to help them. And so Sean Harper from Penn, he actually developed a paper and a framework called anti-deficit thinking, and it shows a comparison between the ways many questions are situated when we're looking at student improvement, student success. And if we go to the third one that I've highlighted, you could ask, why are black male students' rates of persistence and degree attainment lowest among both sexes and all racial or ethnic groups in higher education? And so again, focusing on the students, blaming the students, what's wrong with the students, right? Despite all of these institutional, structural barriers, forms of racism, sexism, you can go down the gamut, we're focusing on what's wrong with the students. An anti-deficit way of looking at it is, how did black men manage to persist and earn their degrees despite transition issues, racist stereotypes, academic underpreparedness, and other negative forces, right? So students who do make it, they are faced with all of these other things that should say they shouldn't, but they still persist. And if we highlight those stories, without just the unequal balance of only focusing on those who can't make it, now we're opening up avenues to replicate those levels of success. And I would say that's true of my own lived experience as well. All right, questions there? Okay. And so one thing I want you to do, we don't have to use Post-it notes, I just have this in here. If you have a sheet of paper or some type of electronic device, if you could just for 1 minute, write down a word that comes to mind when you think of black males. So one word that comes to mind when you hear the term or the phrase black males. All right. And now I want you to add in engineering and see if there's a second word that comes to mind. All right. Do I have anyone who's willing to share one or both of those words? Cindy?
So the first one I came up with was powerful.
Okay.
The second one was unusual.
Unusual. Okay. Would you mind sharing what you mean by powerful?
Able to accomplish a lot.
Okay.
So unusual, I think, speaks for itself, right?
Yep. Any others? Yes, sir.
I said basketball.
Okay. For black males, you thought of basketball?
I'm a visual person, so I picture somebody in my head. It happened to be LeBron James.
Yeah.
I said basketball.
And I mean, that's fine. If that's what comes to mind for you based on the media, certain perceptions we have, stereotypes, it's good that you at least recognize it first, right? And then work around it. Was there a second? Okay.
I said strong and stronger.
Strong and stronger. Okay. And what was your second word when we added the in engineering, if you don't mind me asking?
I thought of Washington Carver.
Okay, George Washington Carver. Okay.
I just think of people, I guess.
Okay, yeah. And so one, analogy there is, recognizing where those terms are coming from. Is it from our lived experience? Is it because the media promotes LeBron James more than maybe any other black male in society? Is it because George Washington Carver is most famous or recognized in STEM, even though there are hundreds, if not thousands of people who've contributed in that field? And so understanding where it comes from, strong and stronger, both positive attributes, could be, I don't know where you got that from. Is it a family member or friends?
Just thinking about the issues that the black men I know have to face.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. One more? Yes.
One more. The first word that I came up with was very similar to Cindy's. It was capable.
Okay.
But with engineering, I guess maybe I was had a faculty hat on. I said opportunity.
Okay. Yeah. Great words. And so the reason I wanted you to do that activity, just so you can recognize, again, the first words that come to mind, recognize if there are any biases at play, and then to see whether they're more like situated in a deficit mentality, a stereotypical mentality, or if they're words that talk about promise and hope and opportunity, you know. And so the purpose of this study, you'll see we wanted to, again, talk about the success stories. And so Buoyant Believers places black males in 4 different categories. We're going to talk about those just in one, the ones who are ultimately successful. And then we're going to situate it amongst 2 different terms that many of you have probably heard: self-efficacy. All right, so one's confidence to succeed in a particular task, many times academic tasks, and then resilience, so ability to bounce back from adversity, right? And so when we were doing this study, of course, there's a lot of work on academic self-efficacy, a lot of work on resilience. Much of it is situated in the social sciences. And so anytime that we have an opportunity to bring it over into engineering, it, I think, is a little bit more powerful and useful. And so if you haven't studied these terms, just to give an overview without going into too much detail, both of them can be linked to motivation, academic success, right? So they are traits that we want all of our students to possess, and they're not necessarily static. So many people believe if you come in and you are confident, you'll always remain confident. Or you come in and you lack resilience, that you'll never become resilient. But it's technically fluid. And so that kind of informed our framework as well, as even though have a high level of confidence in this one subject area, it could change, or it could also transition just when I walk from this building on campus to another building on campus, right? Or when I'm on campus versus away from campus with my family and friends, all right? And then I already gave you a backstory for Buoyant Believers. That was based on Dr. Strayhorn's book chapter that informed our initial use of it, which was the first time it was used in engineering. Any questions at this point? All right. Well, the way I created a visual version of it, Dr. Strayhorn hasn't, and so I'll give that caveat. This is my interpretation of the model. I'll wait until that journal article is published for us to have an official interpretation of it. But I'll start with this category, which is avoidant giver-uppers. And so those are students who lack both confidence and resilience. And the reason we gave them this term is because if their confidence is low and their resilience is also low, one, if a task seems challenging, they'll avoid it, right? And then if they're placed into it, they'll run away, right? So I'm going to avoid as much as I can. And then if I'm already in it, I'm leaving as fast as I can. And again, students are here, but the ideal goal is to move them up into these other categories. And so now we can look at blamers. And although this model was specific to black males, I think based on my experience teaching and my areas of interest in research and other experiences, that we could really map many different students onto this same model. Right? But I'm thinking it has promise, especially for some of our underrepresented students. So I'm confident, right? So if I'm so confident, it can't be me, it must be you, right? You're the teacher, you gave me a bad grade. I know I'm smart. I've always been told I'm smart, it must be you, right? And then our last category before getting to Buoyant Believers is ballers. And so some of these terms we're using to actually identify and make it more culturally relevant to students. We know not all black students like sports, but some do, and there are visible role models in that area, so we are using some of those terms, not to stereotype, but just to identify with our population. But the ballers, very similar to a basketball, right? It keeps bouncing back. But technically, if it has no direction, like if you're not confident, it's going nowhere, right? So it's bouncing back, bouncing back, bouncing back, but going nowhere. And so that's why we call that category ballers. And then the last one, of course, is buoyant believers, and so they're floating, they're resilient, they're confident, right? And they're ultimately successful. Questions about the model? All right. And so the approach we used, we had 27 black males who participated. They were in engineering and engineering-related fields, so they weren't all technically engineering majors, but we feel like STEM holistically has some commonality in terms of structure requirements that it applied, at least for this individual study. And we did one-on-one interviews with those students. They lasted anywhere from 30 to 60 minutes, depending on how much depth the student provided us. We used narrative inquiry, so we studied kind of those long interpretations. We tried not to interrupt students, let them go completely until they were out of anything to say, right, which created those narratives, and then we looked at it from a critical lens. And so we were really using the constant comparison method from a qualitative standpoint, but critically analyzing those narratives. And so another activity I want you to think of, right, if you can take a moment, right, we already situated, ourselves in terms of what we think of black males in engineering, and now just think of students holistically before we get into the findings, right? What are you thinking is going to come out of these different categories? So one thing I want you to think, Are the majority of students buoyant believers? Are the majority of students blamers? Are the majority of students ballers? Or the majority of students avoidant giver-uppers? So if you can take a moment, just come up with what you think is the category that's most prevalent for all students. And then the second spin on that is what category do you think is most prevalent for black males in engineering? All right, and by all students, I do mean all engineering students. I should have clarified that. So all engineering students, what is the category you think is most prevalent for them? And then black male students in engineering, what category is most prevalent? Anyone willing to share? And it can be based on research, your teaching experience, your experience as a student. Yes, sir.
Sure. So I have some teaching experience,
Mm-hmm.
mostly white Caucasian students.
Yeah.
And the majority of students that I've talked to were blamers.
Okay.
So that's, from my experience, I think that's the majority of students would be.
Okay. So highly confident, but because they lack resilience, I'm going to avoid potentially give up on tasks and point the finger at you. All right.
And then for the black male students, my hypothesis is that they're ballers, so they might not have the confidence that they need to move forward. But I think in order to be an engineer in college, they
Mm-hmm.
have to have a lot of resilience to make it through all the other grades and still want to be an engineer.
Okay. One other maybe volunteer?
From teaching high school, I saw a lot of ballers and blamers in the black male community.
Okay.
I would agree that probably a lot of ballers at the collegiate level.
Okay.
I was teaching engineering specifically.
And what did you think of just all students in engineering?
So. Lots of blamers. Maybe that's just postmillennial bias, but.
Okay. And so the reason I asked that question, I don't have an answer for you, right? The finding, so I will say that I do not have an answer for you. So it's a qualitative study. We're not trying to come up with quantitative numbers now. That could be a future aspect of the study. But again, just situating your own thinking prior to seeing the findings. I think we fail to realize that we come in with preconceived notions. And so when we interpret findings, it's based on our preconceived notions. And so if you view all students as ballers or blamers or just blamers, right? When you see the findings, it may either resonate with your own existing preconceived notions or challenge them. All right. Yes, sir.
Comment. The blamers, basically you're describing someone with an external locus of control. And one of the things I see with students is that has a tendency to change.
Mm-hmm.
When they arrive at Clemson, they do typically have an external locus of control.
Mm-hmm.
That's the way they have operated in their educational environment. But through their experiences here, and to be successful, they often have to change. They have to develop an internal locus of control. So it's a lot more complicated, obviously, than we're putting it on. But when you ask the question, students overall,
Mm-hmm.
I pick buoyant believers because we have a fairly high success rate. We graduate a lot of students. So overall, I think they probably are buoyant believers.
And I was hoping at least one person would say that because, again, this study is anti-deficit thinking, right? And so if we're thinking our students lack confidence or resilience, right, when, like you said, 80% at many institutions are retained, right? Some institutions it's 90%, right? Those are high success rates, especially given the diverse backgrounds potentially of our students in terms of K through 12, racial, ethnic composition, gender, and things of that sort. So I was hoping at least one person would situate them as buoyant believers. I do think the locus of control, though, can be dependent on certain demographic characteristics. And so if you're a minority, you may feel like the locus of control remains exterior more so than you taking it on. And if you do take it on, it can be more detrimental for you because you can't necessarily change racism, right? Like you can know how to try to navigate around it, not have forms of anxiety and other negative effects. But if you internalize what you're experiencing because of your race or your gender, right, that can be detrimental to your success because that is outside of your control and should remain outside of your control, right? All right, any other comments before we move to the findings?
I agree. That was a hard one. I could not come up with my idea for that, and I think it's because, I'm interested in the end goal. If I can spend a year with students in a hard class like organic chemistry or something, and I have a good game plan, which sometimes I do and sometimes I don't. But if I have a good game plan, I think we can work together to get them to the buoyant believers. But that's hard to know where they come in.
Yeah, and I hope we all see that glass half full and not half empty, and we can move everyone up to that category. But there are certain strategies that we can employ. All right, so I'll go into the findings here. And so we'll start with finding number 1. And so we're looking at what caused them to become buoyant believers. Again, we're only looking at that one category with this study, which is the other side of your paper that's a bit more narrow. It discusses these attributes. But the first one, especially in terms of resilience, is they face childhood adversity. And so I'll just read one quote from a student. Again, this isn't to stereotype. These qualitative studies are providing us with depth, right? So we're going deep into the lived experience of individuals. We're not trying to say these individuals generalize to all black males, right? And so Charles, he was actually from a large inner city community in the United States. He talks about it in the opening sentence. So he grew up in a large Midwestern city. He came from a 2-parent household. His neighborhood was pretty decent, but where he traveled to and from school, the majority of high school was pretty rough neighborhood. And so although this interview transcript doesn't discuss it, he even mentioned like being threatened to join gangs, for instance, just trying to ride the subway to and from school. Right? Even though he had a strong background from a family sense, just the fact that he was a young black male in this space, there were challenges that he faced. He also talks about here in the next line, it was a lot of adversity he had to overcome as far as being a statistic. All right, so, police brutality, things of that sort. So he's trying to overcome institutional barriers to his success. But he says that he had a great foundation with his parents. And so one reason he wasn't enticed, for instance, to join a gang, even when being threatened with the opportunity of physical harm or violence, is because of that family structure. He didn't need a sense of belonging. So many people who don't understand the history of even gang relations, it's rooted in sense of belonging, right? He didn't need that because he had it at home. He also, compared to traditional stereotypes, people assume that if you're a black male, you must come from a single family household. That's not the case for Charles, right? There are many other individuals like him if we look into the depth of individual lived experiences. But ironically, he did use something stereotypical in order to become successful. So he got a scholarship to play basketball. And if we really want to talk about, institutional racism and access to quality K-12 systems, it's a shame, although it helped him, that he needed to play basketball well to get access to a quality education. So he was recruited to a Catholic private school downtown where his schools weren't, as strong academically just because he could play basketball, right? But the good thing is Charles used basketball as a tool. All right, his dreams were not to just become a professional basketball player. He used it as a tool to succeed academically. So he talks about how he took advantage of going to that school because his neighborhood schools weren't great. And he kind of transitioned from being focused purely on basketball to academics. And so his confidence academically started to change. It wasn't just I can succeed as a basketball player, which can be the case historically if you go to certain schools. That's all you see in terms of those who are promoted, those who are able to leave that neighborhood. And so it can be very limiting. And so he actually uses that exact quote. He used basketball as a tool to get him where he is now, which is in college. He ended up graduating with a degree in aerospace engineering, one of the only black males in his program. All right. The next attribute is a refusal to quit. So also kind of aligned with resilience. And so this is Homer. He is from a large inner city community as well in the U.S., a different one though. And so he talks about his interests and said there was a lot that sustained his interest in his major. For one, during his time there in college, he had funding through a NASA program that he got accepted into in high school. So he had, some type of internship type of experience prior to even going to college. And so one big reason or motivation for him to keep his grades up were for him to have that funding and to stay within his major. And so he also talks about, different categories for trying to be successful and not wanting to be like certain statistics, right? And so he talks about those from his community who went to college, but they also ultimately did not leave with a degree and they weren't successful. So he talks about statistics as well. And so you can see that certain black males in their mind, they know the way maybe they're portrayed in the media, the way they're portrayed nationally, and they're trying to go against it, right? And so that's creating a threat potentially for them. They see how limited opportunities are. I had to get a scholarship to play basketball just to be successful, right? It's a very narrow path for some of them. And so he said he didn't want to go that route, and then he knew that it just never crossed his mind to quit. It wasn't even an option for him, all right? And he ultimately went on to get a degree in electrical engineering. All right, we have another student, Derek, and so the first two were based on many terms that we use, African American, so their ancestors went through slavery in the United States. They were domestic students. Derek is actually an international student from West Africa, and so he talks about the fact that he wanted to be an engineer from an early age. From the time he was 4 years old, he has an uncle who was a structural engineer. So he had role models around that inspired him. He talks about wanting to do things geared towards bridges. And so that made him think engineering was cool. And he said, which is weird since he knows he was only 4 years old and he was already starting to think about this career aspiration. Right? And so he talks about when he was in school, the subjects that appealed most to him were math and science, which we see is true of a lot of our students who go into engineering. Right? He always did well in those subjects, and he also did first year robotics, meaning when he got to college. All right, so that just all cultivated his interest in electrical engineering. And then the last category, which ultimately is what we're calling their view of collegiate achievements or success. So we did let the students define what success meant to them. And so going back to Homer, who was from that large inner city community, Homer being domestic African American, he said he didn't have the best GPA, but he sacrificed his GPA, right? Because he knew that he was able to work and he was ultimately going to graduate, he had a job. And so giving you a little bit more background on Homer, Homer was involved in a fraternity. Homer was very sociable, had leadership roles on campus, again, had working experience. And so what we see for certain underrepresented students is in order for them to find that sense of belonging that doesn't always exist in engineering, they may have to sacrifice their GPA and be heavily involved. I know that was even true for myself. There were some of my peers on my senior design team, for instance, who at the end were shocked that I didn't have like one of the top GPAs based on the way we work together as team members. But I'm like, I'm in this organization and that organization. And I really have to balance myself in order to still have a certain level of satisfaction. All right, and so he talks about, again, not wanting to be a statistic, someone who dropped out and didn't finish. And he does mention spirituality in terms of prayer that helped him through that process. All right. Any questions at this point? All right, we'll go into the recommendation. Yeah.
Question about attribute one. So when I think of freshmen or students in high school, I remember myself when I was pretty disoriented. I didn't know what I wanted to do in life.
Mm-hmm.
So this student says that he used basketball as a tool to further his academic desires.
And that was in high school.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So do you think this was something, so they say hindsight is 20/20. So do you think this is something they came up in hindsight, or do students at that age already have started thinking at such a mature age?
I mean, I would just have to trust what he had in order to get into college in the first place. And so I would imagine if he didn't turn on or off that switch, depending on the analogy you want to use, he would not have had the scores and the motivation to go into engineering and succeed. And so if he was purely someone who was focused on basketball, he was being praised for his basketball talents, he's wanting to become the next LeBron James, I doubt that he's going to be succeeding at the same level potentially in math and science because of the time he may devote to that talent or that craft. Right? And then why am I motivated long term if I know I'm just going to eventually go on and become a basketball player? Or why do I need to spend so much time in engineering with the rigor of that coursework? And so I believe that students mature at different rates, and maybe just due to his background and being thrust into that environment, he saw the opportunity. Again, you hear them saying, I did not want to become a statistic. And so knowing that, success can be hit or miss, I can be pulled over and my life trajectory has changed there. Right? I can commit the same crime as a white male, statistically speaking in the US, I am more likely to be incarcerated for that same crime. Right? And understanding those statistics exist, that people are trying to put me into gangs, right? My life is being threatened. I may be maturing at a different rate than someone else in terms of life trajectory because my life could be taken from me even as a teenager, right? And I mean, he would have to speak further, but I got to know these individuals fairly well, through this process. Any other? Yeah.
It's kind of a question, and I'm not entirely sure what it is yet, but actually, if you could go back to the quote on the last page. So these are all people that you classified as a buoyant believer, right?
Yes.
And maybe this has to do with us trying to take your research in other directions and talking about that locus of control. But I noticed at the end there, he's kind of talking about I was able to weather some storm with some luck and some prayer, and so that's actually kind of attributing even his success to things outside of himself. And I'm just curious, were there other things maybe in the interview where he did kind of take a little more ownership of actually I was successful because I worked really hard?
So he definitely talks about work. He definitely talks about work ethic, what I'll say, and again, I'm bringing my own experience into this, you can be spiritual, give credit to God and things outside of your control without lacking confidence or acceptance. And I think from what I've experienced with these individuals, and then culturally speaking, you know, someone who's humble will not attribute their own success to themselves, at least not in the first time that you're interacting with them and asking questions. They may start to think back on it and say, oh yeah, I did do this, I did do that, which is different from my peers. But typically a lot of students I've seen who fall into some of these categories, you know, I'm thanking God, my parents, my teachers, you know, and even though they're confident and they realize they contributed to it, they realize it took a village. And that is a popular African, you know, saying, it took a village to raise a child. And so they're buying into that saying and not necessarily giving themselves as much credit as they even deserve. Right. But I don't think it means that he lacked an understanding or awareness that he contributed heavily to his own success. Lisa?
With respect to collegiate achievements and this idea that he's involved in lots of different activities and organizations, to what extent do you feel like Black male students have to be really careful in how they craft their image and their, like, I am a fraternity brother, I am a whatever, I am, you know, which makes the, again, not so much thinking about the, like, even the anti-deficit model, but just saying, I am going to take on these positive attributes so that it's really clear I am not a gang member, I am not, you know, whatever. So did you have that sense that, like, they're really careful?
Yeah, I think so. It seems like even their interaction with their peers, they were careful about, you know, let's say being a man of their word. And so if I say I'm going to show up for a study group, I'm there. And that if, I'm participating in this fraternity or other organization, I'm making it clear to my group members that this is an obligation I have. I'm not being dishonest about it. And so I definitely see them feeling weighed down by it. But again, I think the thing that attracted them the most there is that's where they felt like they belong. Right? So in this fraternity, everyone looks like me if I'm in a Black male fraternity. Or in engineering, I'm always standing out. I know Charles, the aerospace engineering major, mentioned how he was one of the only Black males, but there were a few of them in the beginning. And although they didn't say, look to your left, look to your right at his institution, it started to play out to an extent in his program. And then he was like the only or one of the only to succeed. Right? And so it'd be difficult for some of these students. Actually, Homer and Derek were friends in electrical engineering, but they graduated and were one of the only two in their program. And so it's difficult for them to always see themselves as this outsider all day long. And so they found avenues to not feel that way. And then I think at times, you know, you are playing against certain stereotypes about selling out and things of that sort if you're only devoting all your time and energy to this predominantly white space. Right. Question?
You had 27 or 29?
27, yeah.
The majority of them, did they seem like they were urban or rural? Did you kind of have a sense of their backgrounds in one area or other?
So one thing I'll say when I do qualitative studies, I typically try not to form general statistical categories besides the fact that we place them in these four, right, to start. And the reason I was comfortable doing that is because the categories were fluid. If they were static, I would have been less comfortable doing that because, again, the reason I do qualitative work is to provide depth to individuals. And so I did not try to tease out those generalities, whether they were urban or rural or suburban. I think if we do a statistical analysis and a quantitative study, that's when I'll be more comfortable making those generalizations. But right now, I don't really want to do that because I think you can just reinforce negative stereotypes more so than showing this is what an individual Black male said made him successful.
So I have a follow-up question. So how did you select those participants?
So typically we just use like emails, listservs. We may go to an organizational meeting, publicize the event, have people on the campus who would do that on our behalf. And so we just try to identify areas where Black men would see the research call and then invite them to participate. Other questions? Well, I will spend a minute just going over the recommendations and then open it up the rest of the time for questions. But we offer recommendations for the first three attributes. And so you can see child adversity. And so we were saying you can encourage students based on lessons they've had in the past to use those as a catalyst, right, to get them through. And so don't think what you had prior to engineering isn't necessary to be successful. Honor it, recognize it, encourage it. Because there are some individuals who think their forms of, let's say, social capital aren't as relevant, where this form of social capital you can see did help them. Right? The next one is I mean, something I've reiterated throughout this talk, avoiding anti-deficit or deficit-based thinking. So we want an anti-deficit lens. We do not assume because someone's black, they're urban, because someone's black, they're low income, because someone's black, they play sports, all right? Nor do we want to think because they possess any of those attributes that they're less likely to succeed. And if we look at these individual students, we have to recognize there are structural barriers at place that prevent many of them from succeeding, right? From prior to them even coming on campus, I talked about mass incarceration. That is stopping students prior to even getting to college. And if you do get a felony, there's no way in many institutions you can ever come here, right? It's already cut off. If you're low income and you can't afford to come, barriers that are outside of potentially those students' control, especially with discrimination with housing and tax dollars going to local school systems and communities, so many other factors that we need to consider if we are looking from a deficit. It shouldn't be those students or those individuals. What is the society or the structure around them doing to impede their progress? All right. The next one, refusal to quit. So again, inspiring students to hold firm to those goals. So when something comes up, a setback, a challenge, right? Why are you here? What are you really going for? Is it to become an aerospace engineer, electrical engineer, that uncle you had at age 4 who already inspired you? The next one, creating an atmosphere where everyone feels like they belong. I can't reiterate the importance of sense of belonging. Dr. Strayhorn, who wrote that book chapter, a lot of his work in engineering and dealing with underrepresented populations talks about sense of belonging. And I think in engineering, at times we tell people to just turn on and off their emotions, right? To come in and not be people, it's just math. Everyone can plug and chug and do numbers, but we are human beings, right? And so we all feel a need to belong. I talked about gangs. Gangs formed initially so people would have a community in which they belong. Now I know now they have a negative perception, right? That isn't necessarily positive and didn't have a positive origin to it, but that was the backstory there. All right, attribute number 3, so that prior academic success. So reminding them that by being admitted to this institution, we believe they can succeed, right? Once you got in, we were already deeming that you're gonna go on to get this degree and that the things you did mathematically, scientifically, and from a student involvement standpoint, they got you here, you earned that spot to an extent. Right, we're all very fortunate, we're all very blessed to have these opportunities, but they got into this institution, they deserve to be here. All right, and then the last one, and I think this is very crucial for engineering, it actually is a positive attribute of our field, allow students to fail. Right? It is possible, it is okay for you to fail and still master concepts. It should not be that if you fail that first exam, you're getting an F in the final class, or the final grade in that class is gonna be an F. Or if you get an F initially, you're not gonna graduate, right? It's okay to make mistakes. It's okay to pick up where maybe you had preconceived notions or prior experiences in high school that didn't prepare you at the same level of your peers. Right? And that's pretty much all I have in terms of a formal talk. I definitely wanted to give us time to talk based on the format. So I'll open it up to questions. If you need my contact information, it is here.
We're going to go on for 10 more minutes because we got started late. So if you do have a class that you need to get to, feel free to go. But we're going to spend 10 more minutes talking.
Yes, sir.
So you discussed social capital before.
Yes.
How often was that cited among the students?
So I don't think they recognize it besides access to schooling. That definitely came up, and then access to mentors. So outside of that, I didn't recognize them saying that, you know, my parents had this career and that was not the same as my peers whose parent maybe was a 2nd generation engineer or 3rd generation engineer. And by the time I went to college, I was a 4th generation engineer. I didn't hear those comparisons. So I don't know how much they even recognize the value of social capital. I think the good thing is they thought the capital they possess was valuable. And so that's what I'll say. I thought that they thought the capital they possess was valuable, where many times certain underrepresented groups come in and they see that if I don't wear, let's say, a blue suit or a gray suit to an interview, I don't already know to do that with a white shirt or some other plain colored shirt, that I'm not likely to succeed. But they challenged some of those norms, right? They thought the things they had done prior to high school were relevant, or prior to college were relevant.
I was just wondering if you could expand your view on sports. I feel like as innately positive as something that is a way out, but you seem to put that into deficit thinking, and certainly projecting on others that that's all they can do, certainly. But.
Well, the reason I'm saying that, statistically speaking, a black male is highly unlikely to become a professional athlete in any field, especially basketball, which has a 12-man roster. Yeah, as a form of employment, so a goal. And if we know that motivation is rooted in goals, if I set a goal to become a professional athlete and there's a very limited opportunity of me making it, right? One guy from my entire state and my generation may make it, if that. Right, but I see myself doing it, then it's not going to motivate them to be successful. So that's what I meant in terms of sports. The opportunity for you to actually assume that role, where to become an engineer, it's much more apparent. Question?
I have a question about how you can make an environment more welcoming or inclusive.
Yeah.
And I guess maybe specifically, so I really encourage my students before class, no cell phones out, I want them talking to each other. I play some music, it's a pretty loose environment. And I just had this talk with one of my African American females last week, and I said, you've got to put yourself out there a little more, like when you come to class, you need to engage with your table mates and talk to them, because she tends to come in with her headphones in, and she just sits back and she won't lean in and engage, even though the rest of the table may be talking or whatever. And I said, you've got to kind of overcome that and overcome your shyness and talk about that. And she knows it's a problem. But I watched her again today. She came in and one guy was already at the table. She sat down completely across the table from him with her headphones in and pushed back away from the table and didn't even engage with the student. And so how, as an instructor, can I help her feel more comfortable to do that?
So I would say she's doing that for a reason. And so what is it about the class that's causing her to feel that way? It's things you can start to investigate, right? So my curriculum, does she see herself in the curriculum? When we talk about heroes, is it only white males from Europe, right? Or the pictures and images that she sees, are they predominantly male and white? When she has opportunities to have a say-so on a project or idea, is it that she's in a group with 3 white males and they dominate the idea and so she doesn't feel connected? Is she dealing with stereotype threat, where she's coming in, she feels like if she speaks up in the class, everyone thinks this is how all black women think and feel. If she challenges the idea, she's the angry black woman, instead of a woman who just really is challenging the idea and has a valid reason to do it. And when you face stereotype threat, if you're not familiar with the literature, it can form anxiety. And so she could be anxious in that setting because she feels a need to not go with negative stereotypes. There's also another theory called prove them wrong, which is aligned with stereotype threat to an extent, where because I know these negative stereotypes exist, I'm constantly trying to come in and outperform, overwork, just to prove that your stereotypes are wrong, right? And so I think it's not her, it's your curriculum, it's the peers, and maybe there's some bias training that can take place with other students, right? There are things that you can do to comfort her, to say that she's doing a good job, right? That it's okay to use headphones at times, you know? Maybe it's not just completely wrong, because if she has experienced a culture in high school where they were able to do that, and now you're telling her to be completely different from that, where her maybe peers are transitioning easily because the classroom environment is very different or similar in terms of structure and things of that sort. So I would just be careful in, you know, providing harsh feedback or trying to penalize her, because what we see in the K-12 system is black students are more likely to, for the same offenses, right, regardless of what they're doing. And so I honestly don't think it's her as much as it probably is the culture and climate of the environment causing her to take a step back. But I would need to talk to her, of course, but yeah.
I feel like it's almost that in all of her other classes, that's what she does. And so in this class, it's hard for her to kind of adapt into, I need to, you know, we're being all encouraged to talk, I need to do that, and I don't know how to help her do that a little more smoothly.
Knowing something about the curriculum that you're talking about, there may be ways that if taking the headphones out and leaning in just feels either really uncomfortable or she's just tired.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and there's
Yep.
this, you know, like this, I know there's a dialogue out there about like the burden of being a person of color in a predominantly white environment. But so there may be other ways for her to engage that, like, okay, I understand that you've got the headphones and this is where you want to be at the table in this class, but is there a discussion board or some kind of online community or some kind of other way that she can interact with her table mates? I mean, I know a lot of what goes on in that classroom is like problem solving activities in groups, and if she's not engaging that, she's missing out. So are there other ways that she can engage in that process, maybe? Just as sort of as Leroy said, that it's not necessarily that it's wrong, or we shouldn't make her take the earphones off and lean in, because it's, for whatever reason, it's not what she wants to or can do at that moment in time.
Well, like I said, I don't go over and say, like, take your headphones
Yeah.
down.
Oh, no,
But you're not
You
penalizing
know,
her, and it's more just, I watch over the weeks,
Right.
and, she never engages, I never get her. So it's just, like I said, I just don't know how to, like I said, make a welcoming environment. I don't know how to make it that way for somebody like that, who then can't vocalize to me also what she needs, like, because we talked about it in my office, and I said, how can I help you engage? And she can't answer me, so.
Yeah, I mean, things I've seen in terms of if you do group assignments, that it's best to group underrepresented individuals, so women, racial and ethnic minorities, with at least one other individual who they can relate to, so you could do things of that sort. Again, challenging your own curriculum, teaching practices. Are your teaching practices diverse, where they appeal to different types of individuals and their learning styles with that particular subject matter? Because learning styles are fluid as well, although some people place themselves in this one box category, right? Can you make sure that the other students recognize any biases that they're portraying that may cause her to turn off? Because you don't know also what's happening outside of class. So maybe outside of class, they're saying, oh, you're the female, take notes. You're the black student, we give you the task that requires the least amount of intellectual understanding. And so then when she comes to class, she's turned off based on what's going on outside of the class as well. And maybe if you do use technology, you can document those interactions, and then you can see what's going on without her having to speak up and tell you.
I think sometimes too, though, whenever it comes to group work, that, college students now are so individualistic. We want to make my own choices, my own path. Sometimes it's, I want to make my own friends. I don't want you to make my friends for me. And so that kind of works against us whenever we want to build a community in a classroom. This is not the community I chose. This is the community I got by luck. I don't know how to deal with that. Do you deal with that?
Yeah, so what I've done at times is I'll let them choose maybe one or two group members, let's say it's a group of 4, and then I'll assign others. And so then I have some control, they have some control, and then we're more likely to meet in the middle. And again, I know the research saying who they should work with, so I do try to identify someone that they'll be more comfortable working with. But then there's a peer who does come in with a higher level of background information. They're able to do some type of peer teaching, where I don't have all of my black students or all of my women working together, right? And then limiting the diverse interactions that could take place with others outside of those categories. Because what we've seen is that white males typically benefit the most from diverse interactions. It's not women, it's not underrepresented minorities, it's those who have more limited views. And I'm not trying to stereotype, I'm just saying if you haven't had to interact with people who aren't like you, then that you're getting that breadth of experience during those situations, those interactions.
So we probably should stop here, but we have Brown Bag, and everybody's welcome to come to Brown Bag in 107 Fulton. But let's thank Dr. Long and his small gift from us. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your attention. There's a lot of opportunity promised. I don't want to end on a sour note by any means. Yeah.